that's nice. No, but I think these are really, really helpful. And so we'll watch this, and then we'll get into some material I have prepared for an introduction to the Song of Solomon.
The Song of Songs. It's a well-known but not so well understood book of the Bible. It's 8 chapters of love poetry. And while there is an introduction and a conclusion, the book doesn't have any kind of rigid literary design, and that's because it's a collection of poems. They're not meant to be dissected or taken apart. They're meant to be read as a flowing whole and simply enjoyed. The first line of the book tells us that it's the Song of Songs, which is a Hebrew idiom like the Holy of Holies or the King of Kings. It's a Hebrew way of saying the greatest thing. So this is the greatest song of all songs. Then we're told in the first line that this Song of Songs is of Solomon, which could mean that he's the author. His name does begin the book, after all. But as you read the poems, you discover that the main voice is that of a woman called the Beloved. And while there is also a male voice, it does not seem to be Solomon's. Solomon is mentioned a couple times in the poems, but he's never a speaker. And you do have to admit, Solomon is a very odd candidate as the author of this book, given the fact that he had 700 wives. For the lovers in the Song of Songs, they are the only ones in the world for each other. So the of Solomon likely means in the wisdom tradition of Solomon. He was known for his wisdom, his poetry, his love of learning about every part of life. And Solomon became the father of wisdom literature in Israel. And so his legacy is here carried on through a collection of love poems that explores the human experience of love and sexual desire. The opening poem introduces us to the basic theme of this book. We hear the voice of the young woman who delights in her man, a shepherd. Now, she's not married to him yet, but it becomes clear that they're engaged and they cannot wait to be together. From the introduction, the poems flow back and forth from the woman's voice to the man's, shifting from scene to scene without any kind of clear linear sequence or storyline. The poems move in these symphonic cycles, and key images and ideas get repeated and developed. So, one of the basic themes uniting the poems is the intense desire that this couple has for each other, expressed through their constant seeking and finding. So, after the opening poem, they're separated but on the hunt for one another. So the woman calls out, or she'll wake up from a dream or go looking for her lover, and more than once they'll find each other, they'll embrace, and then right when things start to get a bit racy, the scene will suddenly end, and a new one will start. They're separated, looking for each other, and on it goes. Another repeated theme is the joy of the couple's physical attraction for one another. So multiple times, they'll pause and describe each other with these elaborate metaphors. And here it's very helpful to know that these images and metaphors in Hebrew poetry are not primarily visual. If you try and paint a picture of these people based on the metaphors, you will end up with something that looks very, very strange. What you're supposed to do is reflect on the meaning of these images as they relate to the man and the woman. So you'll read through the poetic cycles, and the tension will keep building in their desire and joy and attraction. And this spiraling repetition is a poetic way of heightening and focusing on the mystery and power of sexual love. It all comes together in the conclusion, which pauses to summarize what these poems are all about. Love is as strong as death. Its passions are as severe as the grave. Its flashes are of fire, a divine flame. Many waters cannot extinguish love. Rivers cannot sweep it away. If one were to give all the wealth of one's house for love, he would be utterly scorned. The poem highlights the power and the intensity of love, how it's both beautiful but also dangerous. Like fire, love can destroy people if it's abused, or be life-giving if it's protected. Ultimately, love expresses the insatiable human longing to know and be fully known and desired by another. Love is one of the most transcendent and mysterious experiences in human life, and as a part of the Bible's wisdom tradition, this book says it's a gift from God. After this, there's an odd poem about Solomon trying to do what the previous poem just said was impossible, to buy love. The woman rejects Solomon's offer, and then the book concludes with the man and the woman. They're separate once more on the hunt for each other. He calls to hear her voice. She begs him to run away with her, and that's how the book ends. Just totally open-ended. But that's a lot like love, which never truly concludes, because there's always more to discover and pursue in your beloved. And so true love has no end, and neither does this book. Now, through history, the big question raised by the Song of Songs is, what on earth is love poetry doing in the Bible? There have been three main interpretations of this book throughout history. In Jewish tradition, it's been read as an allegory, each character a symbol. So the woman is Israel, the man is God, and their love is a symbol of the covenant between God and Israel made at Mount Sinai and the giving of the Torah. This view flowed into the Christian tradition, but the characters were swapped. So it's about Christ's love for his people, the church. And this interpretation was inspired by Paul's words in Ephesians 5, that a Christian husband's love for his wife is a symbol of Christ's love for the church. What's interesting is that in the last 100 years, archaeological discoveries among Israel's ancient neighbors in Egypt and Babylon has turned up all kinds of ancient love poetry that's very similar in language and imagery to the Song of Songs. We see that love poetry was a meaningful part of Israel's cultural environment, which has led most scholars today to view the Song of Songs as what it presents itself to be, an arrangement of Israelite love poetry reflecting on the divine gift of love. But that doesn't mean that it's only ancient love poetry. There's a key feature of these poems that sticks out when you read them as a part of the Old Testament, and that's the overwhelming use of garden imagery. There are powerful echoes of the Garden of Eden and the idyllic scene between the married couple in the early chapters of Genesis. So the image of the man and the woman naked and vulnerable, but completely unified and safe with one another, this resonates in the background of the Song of Songs. It's as if in these poems we are witnessing the love of a couple whose relationship is untainted by selfishness and sin. And so ultimately the song holds out hope that even though our own relationships are so often distorted by selfishness, love is a transcendent gift. And it's meant to point us to something greater, to the gift of God's love that will one day permeate and transform his beloved world. And that's what the Song of Songs is all about.
All right. Well, yeah, that's a really good summary of the Song of Solomon, a really good overview. And like they said in there, I'm going to present, I think there is a unity to the book. I think there is not really a structure, like he said in that video, there's not really a structure to the book, but rather there is kind of a design to it. And maybe you say I'm just like mincing words, talking about both sides of my mouth. But if you try too stringently to look at this book and create a narrative out of it, or create a straight-through story and decide that this character is speaking thusly and this character is saying that, and they are the same characters, and there's people have seen love triangles in this book and all that. And maybe so. I think more the idea of this is that there is a climactic kind of design to it, and then anyway, so I'll try and show that through as we go through this material. But I really liked what he had to say about the transcendence of love and just this ideal, this is where I was going to start as well in Genesis 2 in the garden. This idea that the monogamous relationship, like male-female, man-woman relationship in marriage and intimate love, is something that is so connected back to the initial beautiful design God had for mankind in the beginning. And that presents a lot of interesting questions and a lot of interesting things, but really the only thing Song of Solomon does is just kind of celebrate it. Like, this is beautiful, and there's an innocence to it and a just earnestness to it that is just as it was designed to be. And in that is this idea that God is involved in all of the ways that we work. And he designed them, and he built them. And sometimes in Christian circles, ideas that the Song of Solomon is going to talk about can be very difficult for us to kind of stomach, or difficult, that's the wrong word for it, difficult to discuss or to talk about openly. And I think Song of Solomon is a good antidote to get us back to center on that. I don't think we should talk about those things too much. We shouldn't, there's and a pendulum swings with this, but I do think that there is a middle ground to where Song of Solomon being in the pages of the Bible, and the wisdom literature no less, instructs us to be mindful of the realities that, we all came from relationships like Song of Solomon is pointing out, and any kids that are born are going to come from relationships like Song of Solomon is pointing out. And so there's really no use in avoiding these topics, because as long as people exist, Song of Solomon is going to be accurate and helpful and wisdom for us. So that's kind of my hope with looking at this. I mean, it's a good book to look at. It's underappreciated and kind of understudied a lot of times in churches because can be awkward. And so with all that in mind, I wore a short sleeve shirt in case I got uncomfortable and sweaty. So I'm ready. I just hope y'all are ready too. All right, so let's start where he left off, this idea of the Garden of Eden. I love connecting this. There is a ton of images of vineyards and gardens in the Song of Solomon. And I think it does really, Bible Project, those videos love to talk about the Garden of Eden. So they have to take every time they mention the Garden of Eden, those videos, with a grain of salt. But this time I think they're right. You really do see the garden come up a lot. And so just look at these verses in Genesis 2, verse 22 and 23. Then the Lord God made a woman from the part he had taken out of the man, and he brought her to the man. Then the man said, this one at last is bone of my bones and flesh of my flesh. This one will be called woman, for she was taken out of man. I like that. This is the NET, and I like this translation because this song, this is poetry, right? Like the first thing Adam does is burst into this poetic song when he sees Eve. It's like just the idea of the most beautiful, creation, who was made just for him. All these ideas, which is exactly what Song of Solomon, this exact kind of idea and picture of Song of Solomon. This beloved is the only one. For Adam and Eve, it's pretty literally true, right? It's kind of easier. But that's kind of the idea in Song of Solomon, that when there is love like this, it is reminiscent of both the beloveds being in the Garden of Eden by themselves, naked, intimate, fully vulnerable, fully aware of each other. And just the idea that Adam had named all the animals looking for something suitable, and finally God brought Eve to him at last. It's like Etta James sings. It's beautiful. This just really is beautiful. And he sings it's like, she is like of me. She's bone of my bones and flesh of my flesh. This is just beautiful. And so I think these ideas, when you start to look at this, there's just something about the relationship that God built us to have that ought to be rich like this. That we ought to hope and look for and maybe even cultivate or continually engage with this kind of richness in our marriages and our relationships to make sure that they are like this, because if we read things like this, we don't relate to them. There's something there that's like, maybe not everything God intended it to be, not to harp on anybody, but just to say sometimes we forget these things and their significance. And so looking at this really brings us back to the ideal. All right, all that being said, let's get into some of the types, like literature types and ideas, kind of structural ideas of Song of Solomon. One more thing I'll say, I didn't put a slide in about this, but authorship of Song of Solomon is a very interesting question. Like if you look at Song of Solomon, chapter 1, verse 1, the Song of Songs, which is Solomon's. I like, again, everything he said in there was so helpful. Song of Songs, King of Kings, Lord of Lords, Holy of Holies. All these ideas in the Hebrew language were phrases. They were idioms. They weren't literal in a sense, like you just said, read it like that, but they were the greatest song ever to live and exist. This is why in the Latin Vulgate, it's called canticles. It's just the song. It's just called the song is the sense. And I love this because I almost thought I wanted to start this class and just kind of ask everybody, what's your favorite song of all time? Most of the greatest songs in history are love songs in one way or another, aren't they? What'd you say? Yeah, they are. Like there's so many love songs. And what Song of Solomon starts off saying is this one's better than all the ones you've ever heard. Like this is it. This is the only one you need. If you only have one love song in your library, this is the one to have because it trumps the rest. But all the reasons he brought up in that video about, it doesn't directly say that Solomon wrote it, but it does seem to be attributed to Solomon's either gathering of wisdom or gathering of poets and songwriters, which may mean that he wrote it as well. It doesn't really matter in a sense, I think. If you think it matters, we can have that discussion too, that's okay. But I think the idea is that whether Solomon wrote it or he kind of collated it, collected it, and, patroned it in a sense, like he was the one who had it written or in a sense like all that. To me, it does go back to Solomon's wisdom accumulating it. And you can see the difficulty with why having Solomon write this is one of the biggest reasons. It's hard to imagine someone who had 700 wives, 300 concubines to be the one who write the most beautiful poem about monogamous love ever written. But you could see why he might have it written or why he might have written it. So I know I'm being very dodgy here, but it's just We just don't know, ultimately. But it is attributed to Solomon, so at the end of the day, just all that matters is that we know it's of Solomon. He was the reason for it, whether or not he wrote it. So here are some possible types of literature for this. And this is important, if I hope it doesn't seem too pedantic, but I think it is important. First of all, some people have seen this as a drama, so like theater, and there's like dialogues expressing a particular male-female relationships, events. And these are kind of mutually exclusive, but also kind of not exclusive to each other. There are certainly elements of this, but I don't think this is the predominant type of literature. This is not, again, like a stage play where you have Romeo and you have Juliet, and then you have the other guy who Romeo fights, whose name I can't remember right now, and then you have, the parents. It's not like a structure like, oh, this character shows up, oh, this character shows up. It's vague. It's more vague than that, and more about the poetry rather than the drama and the characters. It could be an idyllic song, perhaps for a wedding celebration describing the developments of the male-female relationships. Now, this is the idea that this song was made for a particular kind of like a wedding celebration or something like that. The poetry that we found of the Babylonian, Egyptian, Mesopotamian poetry that's similar, a lot of them are cultic. So they're used for ceremonies where the king would engage in a relationship with the high priestess or stuff like that, and it would be very like, it just gets really weird really quick. And so since a lot of the poetry of the day is like that, there's a possibility this is similar. I don't think that's the case, but it certainly is a possibility. It's a lyrical pastoral poem illustrating a storyline of characters. You can see how these all very similar ideas, right? But I think the best way to think about it is kind of like this dramatic pastoral poem expressing dramatic moments in a male-female relationship. Like kind of just this poem that was looking at the highs and lows of their entire relationship. I don't think the Song of Solomon is necessarily written in chronological order, as if at the beginning of the book they're not married, and the end of the book they are. I think there is kind of an expression of them getting closer and like building. And the middle of the book, I think, is their marriage, but I don't think it's chronological. I think that it's more kind of expressed in significance and in the moments that are around their marriage and around their consummation of that marriage, if that makes sense. And so I think this last one kind of expresses it, where it's more like a couple or one member of a couple looking at their relationship and thinking about the arc of the whole relationship and the intimacy, specifically examining the intimacy and the sexual aspect of it in this way that really is just not really chronological necessarily, but more just about kind of the push and pull and the significance of it, centering on marriage and the consummation of it. Does that make sense? That's my theory. Again, this is one of the most difficult books to understand, the most difficult books to structure. I was listening to one scholar talk about it. There are 470 words used in this book, and 47 of them are only used in Song of Solomon just once, and another 50 of them are used only 3 other places in the Bible. Another 10 of them are only used 15 times. There is like a large percentage of the words in this book are only used here and barely anywhere else. And so even translating this book is very challenging. Not that we should doubt our translation, because what we have the general idea and we have the overall picture of it. But all that to say, it's just a very difficult book to really nail down and say, this is absolutely what's going on. So we have to be real humble in approaching it, is all I'm saying. So this leads to how do we interpret the book, right? How do we look at it with different types of literature that it is? That leads us to that's one building block to the question of how can I engage with it? How can I interpret this book? One is this an anthology, which is just it's a collection of poetry, basically. An anthology of love songs expressing the acceptance of sexuality as a part of a God-designed, respectful, admiring relationship. Another is the allegory. This is how the Jewish people used Song of Solomon. It was only that this love story poem illustrates the relationship of the Lord to Israel or Christ to his church. Now, this one, I think there may be ways you can use it like this, and ultimately every love, like Paul expresses in Ephesians 5, is a representation of Christ in his church. But we can get carried away with that in Song of Songs, and you start to try to imply the specifics of the book, and it gets real dicey. It just gets real challenging if that's what it's predominantly or primarily about. Does that make sense? I think there are secondary applications to this idea. You can put an allegory on it or a type, like we'll see here in a second. Both of these things, but I don't think these are the main the first way to understand it, if that makes sense. There is a primary understanding of this book, and then there are applications of that understanding. And so I do not think this is written predominantly to be an allegory. Because allegories is books like Pilgrim's Progress, where every character is somebody and everything they do has a kind of a poetic or metaphorical meaning. And if you look to this book to be that, it's going to be real difficult to understand all the ins and outs of the sexual relationship and the poetry and all this. It gets real kind of like, I don't know what it's trying to say about God. I don't know what it's trying to say. It's just like, it just becomes really, really more murky than it needs to be. But if you just understand it as love poetry, you can then kind of make principal applications to our relationship with God or Christ's relationship with the church, which is what type is, illustrating the ideal love, using male-female events to illustrate spiritual love of God. It's a parable, possibly. These are all kind of similar. And this is, I think, what we need to primarily read this as. I think literal is a bad translation because poetry is never literal. It's kind of its whole thing. So I think natural is a better understanding. Natural or surface. They are love poems expressing a male-female relationship. Maybe I should have just put only that up there. But I just want to make you aware that there are a lot of people, and a lot of smart people through all of time, who have said, no, it's only an allegory, or it's only this. So I think, and like he said on there, like in recent history, we've unearthed a lot of poetry of the day. And it just is very similar in a lot of ways. And that's what I want to talk about on this slide. So what does it mean that the Song of Songs is love poetry? If everything we've taken so far we can take for granted, that it is kind of these group of love poems, and we should read them naturally, then how do we read it? What does it mean that Song of Songs is love poetry? Well, if you've been in this Old Testament poetry class for any amount of time, or for a long time, I should say, before we started, we talked about Hebrew poetry. Poetry in the Bible, if you remember, is written mostly in parallelism. Does someone have a good definition of parallelism? Do you guys remember what parallelism means? It's been a long time since we talked about it specifically. Anyone want to give it a crack? I should have been re-talking about it more, so it's a failure of mine. Any ideas about what parallelism means? All right, parallelism. Oh, Jeremy?
Is it talking about good in one sense and then evil in the second sense, but also in the same, sentence, basically?
Yeah, that's an example of parallelism, right? It's two lines that are written to be built together, and sometimes they kind of say the same thing, or sometimes they say opposite things, and in the effect of those two lines being put in parallel, then they make a different point. Were you going to say something? Okay. Greg, what did you have to say?
I was just going to say it's comparing two things together.
Yeah. A lot of comparing, contrasting, building. There's a lot of different types of parallelism, but it's not mainly rhyming. It's not like ours is so often. It's not even mainly, like a lot of the English poetry systems we have, you'll not find in Hebrew poetry. This is the point we're making through and through. So every ancient Near Eastern culture, that is going to be shortened as A and E on another line, had love poetry. And it's all very similar to Song of Solomon. These are redundant, but this is the songs. Here's some similarities, all right? So here's like 4 different ways and there's more than this, but these are some primary ways when they start looking into the Babylonian, Egyptian, Mesopotamian love poetry of the day. These are some similarities that are in all of them. So the first one is that the songs are speeches between a man and a woman, and the woman talks twice as much. And that is across every culture, by the way. I think that's fascinating. I'm not going to make any cheap and easy jokes about that either. Because I just think there's something about this that, Song of Songs, especially the conclusion, it's really empowering when we'll read these verses in a second. The woman says, my brothers kind of protected me for a while, and then Solomon tried to buy me out, but I love my beloved, and he's mine and I'm his, and that's it. And it's that's awesome. And she's like, I don't care if Solomon tries to buy my love. I don't care if my brothers thought they could protect it. No, I love my beloved, and that's it. And the woman's the main character, really, in the Song of Songs. And that's how it is in all the love poetry of the day. The woman is kind of, saying leader gets us in it's she leads the way in the kind of this relationship in a sense. There's this dynamic of intimate love. And that, I think, even fits into Genesis 2. I know Adam's the one singing there, or making poetry, but it really is about the woman. And I think the idea of this love poetry, it's interesting across every culture, the woman has twice as much involved in it than the man. Next, there are a lot of I, thou statements. I wouldn't say thou if it weren't necessary. Thou is a specific version of grammar, right? Of the I's and U's. Now, if anyone take French or Spanish, so you know how in Spanish there's tu and there's usted, right? In French, that's what I took, so I think of it this way. It's also tu, or it's vous. Vous is both the plural, like y'all, or it's also just the royalty, kind of proper-mannered. But also, tu also speaks to a level of intimacy. That the other one. That's how all these statements are. They're I, thou. Like thou is tu, right? It's very specific. It's a singular person. And in a sense, all of the language, and this is across, again, all the ancient Near Eastern love poetry, they are speeches that are written in I, thou statements. You and me and you. That's it. Now, they'll also talk to other people about their beloved, in like he and she statements, but most of it's written, and all the poetry is written this way. And through all these different love poetries, lovers are either anticipating or sharing. And it articulates this longing for intimacy. We'll see that in a second as we look at the structure that I see in the Song of Solomon. And then what you may think of as most kind of prominent in Song of Solomon, there are detailed physical descriptions of the beloved. And this is where we get really uncomfortable. But also, it's just, again, it's the beauty of kind of intimate awareness and vulnerable love of just appreciating every single aspect of your beloved. And all the love poetry of the ancient Near East does this with detailed physical descriptions. I thought this was really interesting, that it wasn't just Song of Songs, but all kind of ancient love poetry had these. There's more, by the way, than this. Any thoughts about all this so far? Any comments? Rick?
To understand your wife, your beloved, God designed our wives. They are loved. If there's anybody that knows how to love, it is our wives. And through them, we as fathers and dads, we learn how to love, like God wants us to learn how to love. Mm-hmm. And I think it's an inborn behavior for the most part, and there's always exceptions to the rule. But
sure.
If you got a godly wife and everything that they do is love, and you look at, and if you don't think it's true, look at all those ladies that in the New Testament that was doing something for somebody else, and so we, even Aquila probably learns, from Priscilla.
Sure.
And it's still true, and it always will be.
Yeah.
God designed. Yes, they came from us, or from the way God designed.
Mm-hmm. They're taken from man.
Yeah. However, their makeup is totally different from the way we go about thinking, and we learn how to love even stronger, even more, like that, like it's supposed to be.
Yeah. I think what I love about this being poetry is that it makes us reflect upon our, either upon our own experiences, or if we're younger and haven't had those experiences yet, it makes us reflect on the ideals that we have, the hopes and aspirations that we have. And that's why I think this is an appropriate book. Sorry, I didn't want to say inappropriate. It's a appropriate book to study wherever you're at. I think there is maybe a maturity level. This is one of the things I want to talk about at the end, maybe, hopefully, if we have some time. But I do think there is value in this, not just for people who are married already and kind of have a little more understanding of this by experience, but also for people who aren't married, just to appreciate kind of what God has built in God's mind for this aspect of life, what it ought to be. This can help us avoid, verses like Hebrews, where it says, keep the marriage bed pure. 1 Thessalonians 4, where it talks about our sexual purity, how that's God's will for us. His desire for us is that we be sanctified, and our sexuality and our sexual engaging, the behaviors that come from that, is the battleground for that sanctification that God desires for us. And so God's mind for it is helpful to know positively then, wherever we're at. And I think these things, as much as they may challenge us, we need to have conversations like this with our kids. That God has a mind about these things, that God cares about these things, that God designed us with these things in mind, and therefore we need to be aware of how to operate within those things in the way that God designed us to operate within them. And Song of Songs does that in poetry and kind of represents the most beautiful ideal of that. So here, I'm getting ahead of myself, I suppose. We'll go through these quickly. 3 possible reasons for Song of Songs. First of all, to remind us that the Lord owns creation, reproduction. I got this from someone else, and it sounds so, what's the word? Very clean cut and like distant, which is, I think it's actually helpful for me to read it at least. The remind us of the Lord owns creation, reproduction, mating, and courtship, so his authorized love language builds up while expressing healthy sexual passion. Just the idea that God's involved in all this. Like he's, like we read in Job, he's involved in all the continuation of all these animals. In a different way, God also has a mind and involvement with our sexuality and all that. To show us that there are similarities between the Lord's passion for his people and the passion spouses have for one another, a picture that prophets like Hosea will later note. So this is why you can't read this as an allegory straight up, but you can make some of the points that the allegory would make. Does that make sense? Secondarily. I think I made that point a lot already, but Hosea, in his life, he ends up marrying a prostitute, or Gomer, and that's all a reflection of God and Israel. And finally, similarly, to show Christ's love for his people, the church is like married love. These are all at least appropriate applications of Song of Solomon and the love shown within it. Good. All right, so here's what I see as kind of a structure, all right? Here is a building up or a kind of the movement of the book that I see. Just kind of break it down into 5 sections. In a second, you'll see this one disappear on the 14, and that's on purpose. But really what you see in these 5 sections, I think, again, similar to Job, I think this is written chiastically. So I think that there is kind of a central significance to it, the center section, everything's building up to that. And so here's how I think you can look at Song of Solomon overall. It starts and ends with anticipation and affirmation. This first section will end with one of the lines that gets repeated throughout the song, which is in Song of Solomon 2 and verse 7, I adjure you, O daughters of Jerusalem, by the gazelles or by the hinds of the field, that you do not arouse or awaken my love until she pleases. And this, before the consummation in the middle, this is what it's about. Hey, like there's all this love, all this, all this passion and this desire, but don't awaken it until it's time. There's anticipation involved in it. And then in sections 2 and 4, there is this find, lose, find, and then again in this fourth one, a losing and a finding. And so you start to see, kind of like the Bible Project video did with all the spiraling vines and all, there is this kind of like coming and going, seeking and losing, searching and finding aspect, which is really kind of the meat of this song. And it's really, really interesting. I do want to talk about that if we have time to ask about that at the end. But this is a lot of what defines the relationship, in a sense, is like, they seem to they can't keep track of each other. I don't know if they weren't sharing location or what it was, but they just couldn't really seem to keep track of each other, and they're always looking for each other. But one of the things it communicates, though, is the desire to only be with their beloved, nobody else. That's the only person they want to be with. And in the middle of it is the consummation of the relationship. And you see this kind of build up in this marriage ceremony and kind of finding each other, and it's even put in contrast with Solomon's wedding kind of parade. Probably one of his many. Imagine living in the days of Solomon. We're like, we have to go to another wedding? The guy had 700 weddings. Can you imagine? We're like, get the invite. You're like, dude, this is 460. I've been to the other 467. I'm not going to another one. Doesn't make any sense. I see it. I don't care about it, right? I feel like that's kind of the idea of the beginning of this section. You see, here's another marriage ceremony of Solomon, but me and my beloved, this is our only one, I think, is kind of, that's my understanding of it. But then there's this idea, like I said, don't stir love until it pleases, until it is ready. It's found in 2:7, in 3:5, 5:8 and 9, and in 8:4. And again, in the build-up, it's like anticipating that, but in the end of it, it's like affirming that, like, yes, this is worthwhile. This is how it ought to be. That love ought to be experienced in this way at the right time, in the right ways. So, like I said in the last slide, I cut out 10 verses from the chapter 8. And that's because chapter 8, as much as this is the structure of most of the book, chapter 8 after this kind of has a literary climax and then a conclusion. And the literary climax is actually what they quoted from in the video. Look here in Song of Solomon, chapter 8, verses 5 through 7. Song of Solomon 8 and verse 5. Who is this coming up from the wilderness, leaning on her beloved? Beneath the apple tree I awakened you. There your mother was in labor with you. There she was in labor and gave you birth. Put me like a seal over your heart, like a seal on your arm. For love is as strong as death. Jealousy is as severe as Sheol. Its flashes are flashes of fire, the very flame of the Lord. Many waters cannot quench love, nor will rivers overflow it. If a man were to give all the riches of his house for love, it would be utterly despised. This is just solid poetic lines. Like this is the beauty of it. This is what, I think in a sense, this is like, these are the main verses of the whole book. This is the point of Song of Solomon right here. This is what it's trying to articulate, all 8 chapters is this point that, especially verses 6 and 7, this idea that love is as strong as death, jealousy is as severe as Sheol, its flashes are the flashes of fire, the very flame of the Lord. It's so frustrating. Like I remember being, when I was young and single and like trying to wonder like, what's going to happen with my life? Like, am I going to end up with somebody? Who's it going to be? And it's like, everybody basically boils down to, hey, Ben, when you know, it's like, oh, thanks for nothing. Like that's absolutely zilch help. That's zero help. And the problem is with this particular unique area of life is that these things are true. Like, facing and finding a passionate love like this is just, there's something about it. There are no words for it. It's ineffable, truly ineffable. And it's just like, it's so strong and again, I think this is why the Bible Project video uses the word transcendent. It's not like anything else, and it takes you somewhere else. And that's kind of what Song of Songs is trying to articulate. This is the beauty of it. This is the upside, but also, like I pointed out, this can be the downside. I mean, these things can lead us in a lot of bad places if they're not in their proper place. And again, all this is written in the context of Solomon's life. And I think we have to take that context and think about it, right? So I believe this to be the literary kind of climax of the book, the center point of it. It's not really the center of it, but really kind of like this is the main idea of the whole song. And then it concludes, and I talked about this a little bit, it concludes with this kind of weird conclusion. Starting in verse 8, of the very next verse after the last one, it says, we have a little sister and she has no breasts. What shall we do for our sister on the day when she is spoken for? If she is a wall, we will build on her a battlement of silver. But if she is a door, we will barricade her with planks of cedar. I was a wall, and my breasts were like towers, and I became in his eyes as one who finds peace. Solomon had a vineyard at Baal-Hamon. He entrusted the vineyard to caretakers. Each one was to bring 1,000 shekels of silver for its fruit. My very own vineyard is at my disposal. The 1,000 shekels are for you, Solomon, and 200 are for those who take care of its fruit. O you who sit in the gardens, my companions are listening for your voice. Let me hear it. Hurry, my beloved, and be like a gazelle or a young stag on the mountains of spices. This language is written, and it's kind of hard to know what's going on all the time. But what I think the conclusion is building up to is kind of these ideas like, as the woman is reflecting on love, and it's kind of like marriage and all this, there was a time when she was young, and her brothers were protective of her. I think it's a very evocative time and an image of when she was young, but this is the idea that her brothers were like, hey, this is our sister. No one's going to come near our sister. We're going to protect her. She's ours almost. And then there's this other kind of extreme where Solomon is, he's got his precious vineyard, and it's got all these thousands of shekels of silver, and it's like right after in the last climactic point where it says, if you were to give all your riches for love, it would be utterly despised. It brings up Solomon, who is kind of, money's engaged with his love. It's all kind of about transaction in a sense. That's all Solomon's marriages were power transactions. And then it ends with this idea, hurry, my beloved. My brothers, I'm not my brothers, I'm not Solomon's, I'm yours. And this is the book. Like it ends, and like the Bible Project pointed out again, it ends in this kind of open-ended, like, again, they're seeking for each other. They are lost from each other, separated, and they just want to be together again. I think that's kind of the overall idea of the book. So we only have 2 minutes left. Maybe we'll start the next class with these questions and get into this. But I had 3 questions I wanted to ask at the end of this class. But maybe we'll ask this question for it to be sufficient. Why would God give us a book of love songs like Song of Solomon that glorifies male-female relations when Proverbs so ardently warns against adultery? And what does this show us about God's view towards sex in general? I mean, it's really interesting. The first 9 chapters of Proverbs, there's so many things about adultery and how it'll destroy your life. And the Song of Songs is just like, look at this. This is the greatest thing ever. So how are we, like, what does that say about God's view towards sex? How do we appreciate kind of these extremes about it? Jennifer?
Well, where it's talked about how the brothers are going to protect her, and I heard a synopsis one time about how she might be a little flirtatious or being a teenager. Sometimes young girls are a little more out there than a brother would like. So they are inspecting her to see her character
Yeah.
and to see if she's going to have a little too much fun there, or if they need to build a wall around her to protect her and make sure that she's safe. And I think that the wall is like rearing or more than just protecting. It's trying to keep her away from trouble.
Yeah. No, I wasn't. It's funny. I don't think the brothers are a negative thing necessarily. I know maybe I said that when I maybe it came off when I said it. I think it is talking about a time in her life, right? And as she looked back in the whole scope of her life, there were these different forces that were at work. But now that she was the beloved, those things have all faded away, and they aren't significant anymore. And it's just her and the beloved, right? But I think you're right. I think there is a lot of kind of positive, like hopeful protection, right? And really, you read the stories of the Old Testament, and a lot of times that protection was necessary. It wasn't just kind of like today where it's like, hey, that's my sister. It's like, no, like there was like genuine kind of physical protection needed for that too. Yeah, I think we should start class next time with this question. Questions like this make us uncomfortable, I think. Maybe it's just me, but I think these questions are important because some of these questions, like I wanted to ask I'll send these questions out. We can look at these next time. But why would songs about love of a married couple be punctuated by periods of losing and finding each other? I think that's a really interesting question to ask in this book. And then finally, how can this book be used for us to gain wisdom? And how might it be used for us to share wisdom with our children? And this is one of the things that I'm kind of like, might be one of my hobby horses with this as we study this. I think that there is a necessity, when reading stuff like this and seeing that these are in the pages of the Bible, that God doesn't shy away from expressing his views of sexuality. And as our Father, he's very straightforward about what he thinks we ought to do and how it will be good for us, and the good ways and the beauty even of it, you know. He's not overly negative, but he's like this book's very joyful, and it's given to us by God and his Spirit about the sexual relationship. And I think there's a lot of wisdom in that for how we need to be, straightforward with our children as well. Because if we don't tell them, then the world will tell them. And the ways the world will tell them about this relationship will destroy them, basically. So I've already answered this question for you. But I think about that practically, I'm not saying just give this to your kids, like, hey, read Song of Solomon, It's like, but learning from it and gleaning the wisdom from it about how we ought to engage with this, because it's imperative that Christian parents engage with our kids about this relationship, about sexuality. So anyway, we'll talk about these. We'll start next class with these discussions, and then we'll start to go through these sections and look at them, look at these five sections and examine them. We're going to spend some time in this book. This is a book we never study, so we're just going to go through it. And if it's uncomfortable, it's uncomfortable. And if there's things about it that are tough, they're tough. But we're going to, I think, hopefully have some good questions at the end of each class to discuss why this matters and how we can use this book. So I look forward to studying this with you all, and I appreciate your time tonight. That's all for tonight.